Ladies and gentlemen, a hearty welcome from my side. Dear Vice President Hoffmann-Holland, dear Donna Stanton, dear Judith Butler, dear Robert Quinn, dear scholars, students and guests. It's wonderful to see you all in this room, and I'm really very impressed how many of you really made it to Berlin and to the Freie University Berlin and to take part in this Congress. It's very, very impressive that you all made this effort, so heartily welcome to you. My name is Ulrike Albrecht. I will be the Master of Ceremonies today, so you will see me every now and then on stage, but in between very important speakers. The motto of our Congress is the University and the Future of Democracy. And it's my honor to introduce you to the first three speakers, who are the three hosts of this conference. First of all, it's Professor Klaus Hoffmann-Holland, Vice President of the Freie Universität Berlin. He is a professor of law and criminology and at the same time presiding at a district court. Professor Donna Stanton, board member of the Scholars at Risk Network and a scholar in the field of French studies at City University in New York. And Professor Hans Christian Pape, president of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and a leading expert in brain research. I would like to invite Professor Hoffmann-Holland now to the stage.
Dear Ms. Albrecht, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Donna Stanton, dear Judith Butler, dear Robert Quinn from Scholars at Risk, and dear President Pape from Alexander from Humboldt Foundation, dear Neil Muto, dear scholars, dear all of our guests, it's fantastic to see you here. The University and the Future of Democracy. This is the motto of the Scholars at Risk Network 2018 Global Congress, which formally commences right here and right now. Freie Universität Berlin is proud and honored to host this important event in cooperation with Scholars at Risk and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And believe me, I think you all have come to the right place. Our university was founded in 1948, almost 70 years ago, by professors and by students who were pining for academic freedom in teaching and research, something they sorely missed at Universität unter den Linden, at that time located in the Soviet sector of the then divided Berlin. So this very university came into being as an embodiment of the desire for academic freedom. Libertas, a core value that has, together with veritas, truthfulness, and justitia, justice, become the motto of our university seal. You can actually see it right in the center at that page. And it is the guiding principle of our actions and developments, at least it should be. In 1963, almost exactly at the very same time as now, at 3:20 p.m. on June 26th, the then United States President John F. Kennedy gave his highly acclaimed speech right outside this building, in front of the stairs, with the much-quoted motto, "The free university must be interested in turning out citizens of the world." And in 1968, 50 years ago now, West Berlin was wrecked by students' protests which had originated in the assassination of one of our students, Benno Ohnesorg, and the assassination attempt on Rudi Dutschke, one of our doctoral students here at Freie University. Protest which, in the long run, fundamentally changed German society by questioning established authority and tradition, and by paving the way to many achievements, among them women's liberation movement. These brief spotlights on the history of Freie University exemplify that our university was never one that immured itself in an ivory tower Maybe you can be misled by the situation that we are here in the very leafy suburb of Berlin, but it was always smack in the middle of the action, eager to live up to its founding principles, to connect with partner universities in the West and the East, and to step in for truthfulness, justice and freedom, true to its name as Freie University. And when in 2011, as part of the German Excellence Initiative, Freie Universität Berlin developed a new strategic concept for the long-term development of the university, our executive board decided to honor the university's founders' pledge to academic freedom by apportioning significant funding to measures for the hosting and protection of threatened scholars. From the taking of this decision, it was just a small step for us to sign as Germany's first Scholars at Risk member later that year. And since then we have hosted, or still are hosting, almost 11 scholars. Now, how do you host almost 11 scholars? I have to say it's only almost, because the 11th scholar is still grounded in Turkey due to the cancellation of her passport by the Turkish government. And sadly, there's not much hope for positive change in the next future. That's very at the heart of Freie University. Freie Universität and many other universities in Berlin and other German cities also conceived a welcome program for refugee students in the fall of 2015, which since then prepared an average of 200 students per year for studying in Germany, mainly through German classes, but also by prepping them for the peculiarities of German academia. Dear guests, we are gathered at this Congress because we want to make a difference. We want to stand up for academic freedom and for protecting scholars and the freedom to think, question and share ideas, to quote the work of the Scholars at Risk Network stands for. Who but universities should be in the center of this conversation? Who but universities should turn out not just citizens of the world, to quote Kennedy again, but citizens of the world standing firmly by the values of truthfulness, justice and liberty. The university and the future of democracy are intrinsically tied to each other. Just look at the attempts to close Central European University in Hungary, the dismissal of thousands of academics in Turkey, the free speech wars on US campuses and the muzzling of academic discourse in China. This list, of course, could be now prolonged until the time of the reception, but there are more speakers waiting. I'm therefore delighted to use this opportunity to announce that the Ernst-Reuter-Gesellschaft, Freie University's Friends Association, has launched today a fundraising campaign with the support of the university leadership. It's the aim of this campaign to secure 2 scholarships per year for threatened scholars for the upcoming 5 years. You will find further information about this initiative and others in the campaign leaflets outside in the lobby. The Ernst-Reuter-Gesellschaft hopes that by the end of this year we will have received the necessary support for this plea. I do hope that the spirit of freedom that gave name to our university will permeate this Congress and its various panels, events and discussions. I also hope that those of us who are safe and sound in our familiar environments and who can never fathom what it means to feel so threatened that you are compelled to leave your work, your friends and your families, come away with an understanding of what impact academic freedom violations have on individuals and on societies, and work together to freely discuss solutions. I further hope that this conference and the work we will continue to produce together during these dark days for democracy in many parts of the world will lead to meaningful ideas and to shape the future of democracy and academia in a promising way. Welcome again, and thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Donna Stanton. I want to welcome you all who've traveled from near and from far to be with us at the 2018 SAR Global Congress. I welcome you as a board member of SAR, who, like my fellow board members, is incredibly grateful to the Alexander Humboldt Foundation for their unflagging support of SAR's protection work, and to the Freie Universität for hosting this Congress, which has drawn 586 of you from 72 different countries. Our Congress takes place at a particularly troubling and difficult time, a time of heightened nationalism, authoritarianism, racism, and isolationism, marked by the demonization of the other, 65 million others who make up the estimated number of refugees, economic and environmental migrants, unaccompanied minors, internally displaced persons, and the disruptions and instabilities this unparalleled catastrophe has caused throughout the world, south to north, east to west. Whatever the complex reasons for this conjuncture, Trumpism is its symptom. For Trump's executive order severely restricting immigration from 7 Muslim nations on any visa category affects democratic and humanitarian values and impedes the university's vital interests, as 48 U.S. college and university presidents stated, insisting, and I quote, that if left in place, the Muslim order threatens both American higher education and the defining principles of our country, unquote. Indeed, this ban tests the very capacity of the university to challenge acts that undermine its core values, advancing knowledge through free, unfettered, critical inquiry that is, by definition, global in its scope and reach. We are dedicating this Congress to the university and the future of democracy. It is thus a welcome coincidence that we are in Berlin, where the modern university, arguably, was born and chartered by Wilhelm Humboldt in 1811. An institution of the Enlightenment, it's set to improve the world through the advancement of science and reason, but it was also designed to serve as a counterbalancing force to the Prussian state, to challenge its abuses of power and those of the church, empowering citizens through their higher education to act in defense of the public good. Although we could surely debate the question of the degree to which the university itself is and is not a democratic institution, it remains central to democracy, which is why the university is reflexively attacked by authoritarian and repressive governments. Because the university is key to promoting critical thinking throughout society, it must thus be committed, in my view, to advancing democratic citizenship over and against the neoliberal ideology that casts students as consumer clients who value their academic work only in terms of enhanced economic capital. In our current climate, it is not surprising then that the very university created after the collapse of communist regimes in Europe and designed to be a laboratory of democracy has been under attack. I'm speaking, of course, of the Central European University in Budapest, founded by George Soros, an institution that, believe it or not, has a center for the study of the imperfections of democracies. The CEU has been declared illegitimate by the government of Viktor Orban and is a threat of being permanently shut down, even as this prime minister has promoted the idea of illiberal democracy and closed his nation borders to refugees, making their desperate way west and north. His Jobbik party has just scored major victories in the Hungarian parliamentary elections. But as with the CEU, we are here to fight back and to defend the university and democratic values, one episode at a time, one at-risk scholar at a time. SAR is currently at work on 400 cases and has accepted for assistance 700 scholars. And with your help and those of SAR's 14 formal networks and 9 national sections, we will find academic positions for our colleagues from around the world, and notably today from Turkey, the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. The need for our collective efforts have never been greater, as we remember those who are under arrest, who languish in jails, ultimately who have given their lives in defense of freedom and justice. On Wednesday evening, we will honor the Turkish academics for peace, the recipients of SAR's 2018 Courage to Think Award. AFP's courage and dedication in defending academic freedom, the rights of the higher education community, scholars and students, and thus of our highest democratic value, sets an example for the rest of us to embrace and emulate. We can do it better and better as we go forward together. So over the next 3 days and beyond, let us rededicate ourselves to our core mission of helping scholars across the globe. Thank you so much for coming, and have a wonderful Congress.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Hans-Christian Pape. I'm, since earlier this year, president of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and as Dr. Albrecht told you, I'm also a brain researcher since a bit longer. And my research interest is on fear, anxiety disorders, in particular on panic disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And also for this reason, I'm very glad and very happy that I see so many of you here in Berlin. So, dear Vice President Hoffmann-Holland, dear Donna Stanton, dear Judith Butler, dear Rob Quinn, dear Henry Jarecki, dear scientists, scholars, students, and guests. I also saw some children outside, so dear children. It's a great honor and a privilege to welcome you all to this Scholars at Risk Network's 2018 Global Congress on behalf of the Alexander Humboldt Foundation. When in 2015 nearly 1 million of refugees arrived in this country, in my country, in Germany, it became clear once again that wars and disasters are no local phenomena, which is particularly true in a globalized world. And among those forced into migration were scientists and scholars. Some are here today. And at our foundation, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, we immediately thought and decided right away that we wanted to help. And with more than 60 years of experience in supporting highly qualified, internationally mobile researchers from literally all over the world, all countries and disciplines, we felt we could endeavor on a new field, that of supporting threatened academics, as well as the institutions hosting them in Germany. So we always go for tandems and for couples to make sure that those who leave their countries are integrated right away into a nice and perfect personally bound infrastructure. And with the generous support of the German Federal Foreign Office, we set up the Philipp Schwarz initiative that all of you heard about. And Aid Pride Foundation got in quickly and rolled out quickly and provided additional funding to be able to jumpstart from scratch the initiative. And those foundations being the Krupp Foundation, the Mellon, the Thyssen, the Henkel Foundation, the Schirra Foundation, the Bosch Foundation, the Stifterverband, and the Mercator Foundation. And it's needless to say that we are very grateful to all of our founders for your gracious and their gracious support. And now, after the start from scratch, it's 3 years later, and the aim of the Philipp Schwarz initiative seems to have turned out into a reality. We have by now provided support to literally 124 fellows who are being hosted at 66 universities and research institutions in Germany. Who might have thought about this 3 years ago? And now, today, with you all being here and setting up this initiative and the previous initiatives, 3 organizations abroad are worth being mentioned because they are also instrumental. The Council for At-Risk Academics in the UK, the United Kingdom. Let me welcome Stephen Wadsworth. The Scholar Rescue Fund, and it's an honor, and I was very pleased to meet you for the first time today, to welcome Henry Jarecki and Sarah Wilcombe. Please be welcomed. And last but not least, the Scholars at Risk Network, the main organizers here, also called SAR, as you all know. And I especially wish to welcome Donna Stanton, be welcome, and of course Rob Quinn and his staff, and you will give the real talk in a little while. I know these introductory remarks have to remain short, and we should give way to the real information and to the real scientists and scholars. Our collaboration with SAR has led to the creation of what is now the German section of the global SAR network, with close to 40 universities as members. And of course, new members are always welcome. As secretariat of the German section of the Scholars at Risk network, our foundation, the Humboldt Foundation, provides a forum for networking and for learning among those committed to supporting threatened scholars and scientists. And when we heard about this Congress, the Global Congress, we immediately realized the unique opportunity it would provide. Number one, bringing German institutions into contact with organizations throughout the world. 3 of them I've mentioned before. Secondly, learning from each other. And last but not least, making a strong and heard statement about academic freedom. And with this, indeed, we are proud that we have managed to bring the 2018 Global Contest to Germany for the first time, and that the Freie Universität Berlin has joined the Scholars at Risk network and us as a third partner. Thanks a lot for providing this wonderful venue, and I learned it's named after Henry Ford III, which is the grandson of Henry Ford, the car builder. So for those who might worry and wonder why it's Henry Ford, it's number 3, which personally I also learned about only 10 minutes ago. And you won't forget. I now look forward to a conference with many fascinating speakers and participants from literally all over the world. I expect you and us to have thought-provoking interventions and certainly also controversial discussions. This is why we are all scholars and scientists, and this is good. And we wish, of course, to provide a space, a room of academic freedom where many voices can be heard and interact, in an atmosphere of mutual respect and trust, even if we might disagree. And there will be disagreements, I guess. This is what academic freedom is all about. And let me finish, last remark, by quoting our eponym Alexander von Humboldt. You all heard about him as a great universal scientist, a scholar and adventurer of the 19th century. But what may be less known to some of you, he was also a great proponent of academic freedom and human rights in his own time. And in one of his many letters that he wrote, it was more than 3,000 handwritten letters, he said and wrote, and I quote, "Let us never lose our trust in the useful progress of research. Let us never succumb to any influence that limits our freedom of thought." End of the quote. And with this, I would like to close my remarks and wish us all a successful and interesting and mind-provoking conference. Thanks again to all of you for being here.
Vielen Dank. So thank you very much to all the 3 welcoming address speakers. And now we come to the real speakers, as you said, Professor Pape. I would like to introduce you to the first speaker, who is Dr. Neil Muto. Until 2016, you were head of the sociology department at Nişantaşı University in Turkey, and a public intellectual and activist. Her life changed drastically after she signed the Academics for Peace petition and was accused of being a terrorist. Like so many others, she was finally forced to leave her country. Dr. Mutluer was one of the first scholars funded by a fellowship of the Philipp Schwarz Initiative. She currently holds an interim professorship at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where she stands in for Federal Constitutional Justice Susan Beer, who will speak at the Congress later on Thursday. Dr. Mutluer, congratulations for your new position, and I give the floor to you. Good luck.
Dear colleagues, let me start by expressing my appreciation of the solidarity we show for one another as scholars, and by thanking to those colleagues at SAR and Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and universities who devote their time and energy to operating the institutional and financial infrastructure necessary for our shared feelings of solidarity to produce real, tangible results for those of us who actually need them. Solidarity is a two-way street. By its very nature, there are givers and takers. There are donors and recipients. And there are scholars and scholar voices. But I think we should resist the temptation of categorizing and treating one another as saviors and victims, for we live in politically volatile times. Particularistic populism, outspoken disregard of human rights, a blatant devaluation of human life seem to be on the rise, and not only in what we consider to be the crisis zones of world politics like Turkey, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Venezuela, or India, but also in European and North American countries where we can still find safe havens. We must be clear about one point. We are scholars who are at risk, not because where we live, but because we are scholars. If the first victim of war is truth, then the first victims of war-prone dictatorial regimes are us, scholars, who by definition do not possess but pursue truth. This has been the case in the terrible first half of the century, which witnessed many genocides. Today is the commemoration of one of them, the Armenian genocide. 103 years ago today, on April 24th, the Armenian genocide began with the rounding up and deportation of Armenian intellectuals from Turkey. As a citizen of Turkey, let me take this opportunity to express my heartfelt feelings of solidarity with those who still have to struggle for the truth of that genocide to be accepted as such. And 2 decades later, in the darkest moment of European history, Philipp Schwarz opened an escape line, this time for Jewish scholars living in Germany, and one of the safe havens he found for them was in Turkey. And now, less than 100 years later, an initiative that bears Philipp Schwarz's name supports scholars, among others from Turkey, to find safe haven in German universities. My point is, who can say with any measure of certainty that today's safe havens will always remain safe and today's saviors will not be tomorrow's victims? Who can say with any measure of certainty that distance war can be kept distant simply by raising skyscraper walls or striking shady backdoor international deals with dictators? Let's accept it. Whether they occur in our country, or in neighbor country, or 2 or 3 countries, or even an ocean away from us, we are already part of those wars, and those wars are already parts of our daily lives. Don't misunderstand me. I don't mean to say that we scholars coming from crisis zones should not feel lucky because we are here. We have had a first experience of what it means to be dispossessed, because we all come from geographies which will live on in our memories, together with the memories of all our tangible and intangible losses. Now that we are out of the conflict zones, we feel we are safe in relative safety, and there is nothing wrong with that feeling. But that feeling of safety should not prevent us from raising the question, is Europe indeed a safe haven even for the Europeans themselves? The values of freedom, of equality, of democracy, of human rights, in modern sense, they are all formulated in Europe, that's true. But in this volatile day and age of world politics, can these values be defended exclusively within the borders of Europe alone? Can we say that they are already adequately protected in Europe? And can we talk about academic freedom as something that already exists in Europe in a real sense and is here to stay as such? The answer is yes and no. Yes, it exists, because here I am, one of the more than 2,000 peace academics from Turkey whose colleagues and students are fired from their positions, are stigmatized as terrorists and facing prison sentences. Here I am, now living in a country voicing my criticisms and doing my research. I will have the opportunity to discuss my criticisms and even my research further with other colleagues from all around the world throughout this Congress, and that's great. And yes, on paper, we are a diverse bunch of scholars, we are all free spirits, and we see and treat each other as equals. But at the same time, the answer is no. I would not be true to my own personal observations in the European universities if I did not tell you that equality, diversity, and freedom on paper do not always translate as equality, diversity, freedom in actual fact. The mere presence of gender, ethnic, sexual, racial, and class-based diversity does not always mean the presence of gender, ethnic, sexual, racial, and class-based inclusiveness. This said, I would like to conclude my speech on a hopeful note. This moment in history represents the European universities with a unique opportunity to diversify and buttress critical thinking. We can generate a truly transnational academic environment without borders, an academy which gives equal voice to all scholars without distinguishing between guests and hosts, an academy which not only celebrates but also learns from diversity. Can we do that? Can we learn from each other's diverse experiences and expertise to develop a profound understanding of our present and to build more promising future for our kids? Can we turn the encounters between scholars and scholar voices, between hosts and guests, into productive opportunities for academic and artistic creativity? This is what we owe at the very least to our persecuted colleagues who are not as lucky as we are, who got stuck in crisis zones. And I think we can. It's our very real solidarity as scholars that gives me that hope. And I thank us all for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mutluer. I would like to welcome to the floor Robert Quinn. Rob is a founding executive director of the Scholars at Risk Network, a passionate proponent of academic freedom, as I know, and if I may say so, a wonderful partner to the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation as well. He will now set the stage for us and introduce us to the concept of our joint conference, The University and the Future of Democracy. Rob, the floor is yours.
Albert Einstein met Stephen Hawking at the gates of heaven, and they went to have a coffee. "Well done, Stephen," said Einstein. "Scholars will study your equations for generations." "Thank you, Herr Professor," said Hawking. "But I regret that I never got a chance to perfect my greatest discovery." And with that, Hawking explained that by combining Einstein's theory of relativity with his own work on black holes, Hawking had discovered an equation that allowed him to alter the space-time continuum. In other words, a time machine. "That's impossible, Stephen," said Einstein. "You said so yourself many times. But if you did, think of the knowledge you could share. Think of the suffering you could prevent. Think of the refugees of my generation. You could go back before the war and warn people. You could warn people about the spread of nuclear weapons," added Robert Oppenheimer, sitting at the next table. "You could warn people about the catastrophic effects of climate change," added Wangari Maathai, sitting nearby. "You could talk to people about the disenfranchised, the oppressed, and the impoverished," added Nelson Mandela, Liu Xiaobo, and Eleanor Roosevelt. I know," said Hawking. "I'm telling you all, I tried. I went back in time repeatedly. I talked to people when they were making difficult decisions. I provided them the best available data, and I reasoned with them, and I showed them how to avoid bad outcomes. And it helped. When I left them, history was on a better path. But whenever I got back to my own present time, things had drifted off course. But I kept trying. I couldn't give up. We scholars are a stubborn bunch, you know. Eventually, I realized that if I wanted the changes that my machine was making in the past to carry forward into the present, I needed it to make many small adjustments along the way. In other words, I needed it to be self-correcting. This, it turns out, requires massive amounts of data on every conceivable topic in every possible discipline, because there's no way of predicting what information or what insights might be necessary. Did you try AI? Asked a thin, bearded gentleman in the corner. Yes, Jobs. I infused my machine with the best intelligence, human and artificial, and it helped. But then I started to see that the many small adjustments the machine was making began to accumulate into very considerable negative consequences for the majority of humanity. Civil wars, inequality, loss of privacy, an erosion of culture and public spaces. It seemed that even the greatest intellectual discoveries, if not properly tended, can have very negative consequences. Yes, I know, said Robert Oppenheimer. I started to realize, said Hawking, that my equation needed something. It needed some force that would help to encourage constructive outcomes. It needed values, said Eleanor Roosevelt. That's right, said Hawking. Although at first I resisted. As a scientist, I believed in the perfect neutrality of the intellectual exercise. I still believe in neutrality of outcomes. We must follow the data where it leads, but that does not mean that we are neutral as to the environment in which inquiry takes place. The environment is never fully neutral, and to pretend that it is introduces bias into the system. Bias not towards truth and correctness, but bias in favor of whomever or whatever has the most power, said Mattei. That's right, said Einstein. So I did the only rational thing. I infused values into the core of my intelligent, self-correcting time machine. The first was freedom, said Mandela. That's right, academic freedom, and the autonomy of institutions to carry that freedom into practice. But that wasn't enough. It left too many people out of the equation. So I introduced the concept of access, said Eleanor Roosevelt. That's right, said Hawking, equitable access. That helped to guard against bias by making sure that the widest range of qualified viewpoints was included. But still, that wasn't enough. Because even with perfect equity of access, relatively few people get to participate in the intellectual exercise. My equation needed something more. It needed something even bigger. It needed a concept of social responsibility, said Lou Xiaobo. Yes, that's right, said Hawking. The responsibility of intellectuals like us to use our freedom for the public good, and also accountability. The responsibility to organize our affairs in a manner that is consistent with the public trust. Did it work, Stephen? Asked Einstein. Did including values make a difference? Well, Hawking said, as I told you, I never got to perfect it. But on my last trip using the machine, the data looked promising. When I returned to early 2018, in places where intelligence and values were given the freedom to flourish, we saw a marked increase in meaningful inquiry. Students, in particular, in early 2018 were beginning to come to life, and public discourse was beginning to push back on falsehood and xenophobia. There were still places where things were drifting off course, places where values were not observed, but overall, yes, values were making a difference. I was about to publish my findings with the world when, ironically, I ran out of time. Stephen, that's tragic, said Einstein, with tears in his eyes. You were so close. Humanity was so close to a better future, and now it's lost. Well, said Hawking, not entirely lost. When I realized I was running out of time, I used the machine to go back and leave copies of it all over the world. I left copies in capital cities and in regional centers and smaller cities. I wanted people all over the world to be near one, hoping that people would figure it out, that they would figure out what the machine could do and how it gave them the capacity to produce a better future, not just for a few, but for all of humanity. Did they, Stephen? Asked Einstein. Did they figure it out? I'm Rob Quinn. I'm the Executive Director of the Scholars at Risk Network. And I want to echo the earlier speakers in welcoming you all to the 2018 Scholars at Risk Network Global Congress. We are honored to be partnering with the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and the Free University and all of you on this historic event. Your presence here, in the presence of over 500 institutions in our global network, tells me that you have figured it out. You understand that the university, that higher education, is the closest thing we have to a values-based, intelligent, self-correcting time machine capable of producing a better future. Today, our present is our great-grandchildren's past. They may not be able to travel back in time to us, but they most certainly will look back through time on us and ask what we did in our time. Today, our network, our members, our partners, all of you are doing more than ever. Last year alone, we assisted over 400 scholars. We documented over 150 attacks on higher education communities in 35 countries, affecting thousands. We issued over 9,000 appeals on behalf of wrongly imprisoned scholars and students. We organized hundreds of workshops, talks, lectures, and events, all demanding greater protection. Sadly, though, the demand for our help is also greater than ever. The theme for our next 3 days is the university and the future of democracy. It suggests that we still have a lot of work to do. It suggests that the university is under threat, but also that democracy itself is under threat. It suggests that democratic values are under pressure, and that we in the higher education sector have a responsibility to develop, explain, and defend those values. Your actions and the actions of your institutions in hosting threatened scholars tell me that you have already figured this out. So let us use these next 3 days together to recommit ourselves to each other and to meeting this responsibility. Let us learn from each other. Let us challenge each other to speak truth, to listen, to understand, to do more, to do better, so that when our great-grandchildren look back on us from their time, they do so not asking about what we didn't do, but do so with pride and gratitude for what we do now together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, for this wonderful talk, and also thank you very much for the inspiring and wonderful talk to you, Dr. Mutluer. I think we need some time to think it over, so I think it's just the right time for a musical interlude. I would like to invite our musicians, because we will now hear music of the Syrian-Dutch Arts and Music Project, and it's called Dreaming of Syria. Thank you very much and welcome. So thank you very much for this wonderful music. We will see each other later on. Ladies and gentlemen, I hardly need to introduce you to the next speaker. Judith Butler is one of those scholars whose works transcends academic as well as national boundaries, and whose writings have entered the public consciousness in many fields and on many levels. We are deeply honored that she has come to us, to Germany, and all the way from California, Berkeley, to talk to us on what is freedom and open inquiry, academic freedom and political expression. Judith Butler, the floor is yours.
I'm very pleased to be here today. I want to also thank the Scholars at Risk Network, the Freie Universität Berlin, and the Alexander Humboldt Stiftung for their coordinated efforts to bring us all together to reflect on this important topic. I'm especially honored to be among so many people who have dedicated themselves to expanding the network of support for scholars who find themselves subject to censorship, imprisonment, and exile, who have lost their positions and worry whether they will ever find again institutional support to carry on their research and their teaching. For many, it is not only that they have been deprived of their position on the basis of their political viewpoints or on the basis of conjectured or attributed political viewpoints and affiliations they do not have, but they've also lost, at least for this time, their vocation. An academic position can be lost for many reasons, and another one can sometimes be found. But for those who are forced to leave their country and their position of employment, they also lose their communities of belonging and forfeit a vocation for which they have often worked for years. A vocation names the accumulated history of a life of research, its direction, and its commitment. One thinks and studies a certain way. One is dedicated to a form of inquiry and a community of interlocutors and collaborators. A faculty position makes it possible to pursue a vocation. It provides the crucial infrastructural conditions for writing, teaching, and research. It pays the salary that sets a life free to pursue dedicated work in one's field. Scholars in exile lose as well their ability to work in their own language or in their own country. They lose the power and the freedom to pursue that passion, their commitment, the scholarly trajectory of their lives. A scholarly career can be destroyed by universities or governments on the alleged grounds that the content of the work, real or imagined, is determined to be a threat to existing powers. Perhaps it was the syllabus for a course or the topic of a dissertation thesis that one advised that brings down the wrath of the state, or perhaps it was occasioned by the political position one has taken within the university or outside its walls: unionization, demilitarization, opposition to nationalism. These political positions are distorted by the censors and by those with the power to destroy a career and expel a citizen. They are the exaggerated, demonized, and sensational versions of the political positions the scholar may hold. For instance, a call for democracy is interpreted as sedition. A call for peace mutates into an alliance with terrorism. A call for freedom is taken to be a call to violence. As we know, the actual political viewpoints for which scholars are punished can be directed toward a government or its policies, It can be directed towards universities and their unfair practices, its modes of exploitation, its use of the security police to quell open inquiry and public discussion, to conduct surveillance, its ties to corporate or state interests that leads it to police its faculty. And we know that it can be the university that censors and dismisses the faculty, or the regional government, or the state, or a complicitous alliance among all those authorities. It matters whether we are speaking about academic freedom or the freedom of expression, and I will turn to that in a moment. The punishments for both, however, take several forms: incessant harassment, threats of violence or actual violence, blacklisting, surveillance, overt or covert censorship of publications, internal hearings or public trials with no due process, open threats, dismissals, and expulsions from the university, from the country, or from both. For scholars at risk, it is, yes, a faculty or research position that is destroyed, but it is also a vocation, a form of life that is threatened with dissolution. It is also one's physical existence, the time and space in which a life has flourished, the country and language in which one has undertaken one's work, the collaborations that take years to form. We need only think about the 2 decades of legal persecution against Pinar Selek, faulted not only with teaching and advising on the Kurdish question in Turkey, but falsely associated with an explosion in a market without any empirical support for the claim that the explosion was a bomb, but also no empirical evidence to link her to the incident. Evidence is manufactured or distorted, or academic topics are considered so incendiary that the life of the researcher is imperiled. At least 3 faculty members in gender studies at the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil were threatened with their lives for working on the topic of gender. Gender, that diabolical ideology, apparently, that must be excised from various countries around the world. What were they working on exactly that was so incendiary? The gender division of labor in the workplace. Okay. Or consider Mohammed Habibi in Iran, whose support of teacher unionization landed him in prison. We're gathered here to affirm a commitment to those individuals who suffer in all these ways. But let us consider for a moment the difference between academic freedom and rights of political expression. Both rights of academic freedom and extramural political expression require institutional structures and support within the university, and they require a commitment from universities to support those freedoms. Indeed, the task of the university is undermined when both of these freedoms are imperiled. And though we consider each of these cases of scholars at risk separately, they are bound together by a larger problem, namely that universities have either failed or lost the power to safeguard these 2 freedoms. To exercise that power, to make good on that obligation, the institution must resist forms of external intervention which would seek to control either academic inquiry or punish extramural speech. Today, I will argue that these 2 distinct and interlocking freedoms are not only critical tasks of the university, but that the university loses its integrity as an institution when external attacks on those freedoms prove successful. We are here in part to know the harm in the present and in the future, and to consider how best to organize against the destruction of freedoms which strike at the heart of the university itself. Let us then keep in mind the International Association of Universities, who have argued that it is the central obligation of universities to protect academic freedom and to protect and promote those forms of inquiry, however agonistic, that allow for knowledge about the world in its many vicissitudes. Let us add to that a second principle, namely that scholars ought not to be subject to censorship or retaliation on the basis of their political expression within the public sphere. As academics today, we can only defend academic freedom by holding educational institutions accountable to the norms that belong to academic freedom, and by supporting those organizations that seek to protect academic freedom when colleges and universities fail to uphold those ideals or have been deprived of the power to uphold them. Academic institutions tasked with keeping critical inquiry open must resist the interventions by state and religious authorities, by corporate funders or granting institutions to intervene in the university and mandate what subjects and courses ought to be taught and valued, and what subjects and courses may not. If and when the government or any other external power intervenes with political interests in the university to mandate or censor its curriculum, its direction, its standards, then the autonomous judgment of the faculty is undermined, knowledge is restricted and distorted by political censorship or corporate interests, or by the university's alliance and complicity with corporate or state interests. When that intervention is not stopped, the exercise of the freedom to think becomes punishable. And when and where the university loses its autonomy to make such decisions on its own because the state or the corporate funder or the religious power has entered into the university to decide the question of which knowledge is valued and which devalued, which is safe and which is dangerous, then the autonomy of faculty to decide the curriculum, the aims of research, the topics for debate is undermined or destroyed. And when administrators ally with those external powers who seek to undermine the autonomous judgment of faculty, they participate in the destruction of their own institutions by allowing political pressure to restrict the freedom necessary for thought, the freedom of thought itself, for they are restricting the open-ended inquiry that defines this very specific form of freedom that we call academic, and by withdrawing the infrastructural support it requires. Academic freedom presumes and fosters contesting intellectual views, for only through open and engaged contest does thinking become more nuanced, more grounded, more persuasive, and even more closely allied with the pursuit of truth. Hence, when that vital contest of viewpoints is suppressed, this, in turn, suppresses the critical potential of thought that the university is obligated to keep alive. And by critical, I don't mean something that's just negative or taking things apart or debunking their reality. Critical means trying to find the justification for what we claim to know and offering an argument for that justification to others who can contest what you say and before whom one must develop and defend a position. So that contestation, that productive contestation, is part of what we mean by critical inquiry. Academic freedom and freedom of expression are not the same. The professional activities pertaining to one's academic position should be protected by academic freedom. The extramural utterances any of us make about the world we inhabit, the institutions in which we work, or any matter of public concern should be protected by rights of free expression. That does not mean that academic freedom permits any kind of expression in the classroom. It does not. Nor does it mean that all political utterances are equally legitimate. No, that has to be openly discussed. And still, however internally complex these rights are, and no matter how open-ended the debate about their meaning and their limits, they constitute principles that must be defended. Indeed, the open debate about their meaning and their limits should be one way that we both enact and defend these principles, for an open-ended contest of ideas is precisely one of their aims. The focus of our concerns, however, are those forms of expression that are considered so threatening to an existing power that it seeks recourse to forms of detention, threat, termination of employment, and forced exile to keep that viewpoint from being expressed. Or perhaps we should think about it this way. The viewpoint is publicly punished through termination of a contract or expulsion from a country precisely in order to strike fear and terror into the hearts of those who might consider taking a similar public and critical stance towards the same power. Although the figure of the wall separates academic freedom from political expression or extramural expression, this wall is porous. It has windows and doors. The light of the outside world casts its shadow within the academy, and the intensity of work within academic walls often spills outside into the halls and onto the streets. Indeed, that is, in fact, one way to define a good academic seminar. A consideration of both of these two freedoms elucidates the global obligations of universities in the present time to oppose censorship, the criminalization of knowledge, and the destruction of the vocational life of those who come under attack for their real or imagined viewpoints. Universities have obligations to many publics, not only to their local, regional, and national communities, but to a broader global community. And that is now partially because research depends on global exchange, translation, and international publications. Abiding by international norms of academic freedom should itself become a norm so that the erosion or destruction of that principle remains a global commitment. Indeed, only an expansive and vigilant global solidarity of higher education institutions can illuminate and defend these two interlocking freedoms, object to the persecution of scholars, and seek to stem the tide of growing anti-intellectualism and censorship. The open and shameless contempt for open inquiry that insists on telling histories of the subjugated that governments would prefer no one knows. By insisting on the freedom of thought under conditions of constraint, we give support to those who would question the legitimacy of unjust political forms, including the political structure of the university itself when it offers its fate to corporate interests or state powers. Those who pursue forms of knowledge that contest established beliefs that support racism, misogyny, the exploitation of workers, those who think critically about authority, power, and violence, who struggle for the unionization of academic work, for critical inquiry that refuses to ratify state ideologies. All of those people are potentially or actually scholars at risk. Academic freedom is a right, a power within the university, and only to the extent that it is exercised and guaranteed within its institutional forms. The right does not precisely belong to the individual. Academic freedom is not a personal liberty. It emerges rather from the compact made between the institution and the faculty member, one that must be rigorously protected from intervention from external authorities. In fact, it's a compact between the academic researcher, the university, and the state, for the state must accept the academic freedom of institutions and agree to restrain itself from intervention into matters that only those appointed within the university are entitled to decide. Since scholars, however, are also citizens or members of a broader public awaiting citizenship or trying to work their way in a world without citizenship, they also have their concerns about public life. They're entitled to extramural speech, speech that happens outside the walls of the university, public speech that expresses political viewpoints on any number of issues, including the actions and policies of states themselves, the actions and policies of universities. If and when public speech is critical of the state and those criticisms can range from specific state policies to the legitimacy of the state itself, then what guarantees, protects, or enables such speech? Academic freedom includes the provision that academics are entitled, like all citizens, to engage in political expression in the public domain. In the case where that extramural expression takes the form of political dissent against authoritarian regimes, the university has an obligation not to let the state inside the door of the university. The resistance of the university to external political interference demonstrates the relation between academic freedom and the idea of the university as a sanctuary where police are not welcome. As we know, sanctuary is a vanishing ideal within the new security state, but one worth reanimating not only for scholars at risk, but for the undocumented and those who engage in political dissent. In other words, all those who have reason to fear the state by virtue of their precarious positions in these times. This brings us then to political dissent. In principle, a state must allow for the expression of dissenting views if that state understands itself as democratic, even when those views criticize the policies or the legitimacy of the state itself. And yet we know that many states fail to hold consistently to this principle, all too quickly identifying public criticism of the state with treason or a threat to security. Ideally, a government should commit itself to transparency and welcome open scrutiny of its own decisions and policies, its laws governing citizenship and migration, its entrenched forms of discrimination against racial and religious minorities. But, of course, open and public criticism of a state can become political dissent when it's voiced by a citizen who belongs to that state. It becomes a different kind of political critique when it's voiced by those who are deprived of citizenship or others who live outside the border of that state. The practice of critical inquiry cultivated in the academy often looks suspect to those states which seek to shield themselves from public criticism or open political opposition. They transmute their fear into destructive power, and censorship and retaliation are too often the consequences. Indeed, we would not be here today if censorship had not worked to destroy voices and careers, had not been effective in dispossessing scholars and exposing them to precarious economic conditions. And yet censorship as a form of power shows its weakness. It indirectly admits the deep fear that censoring authorities have of the power of speech, of critique, of open-ended inquiry, which can and does include calling into question the justification for governmental actions, raising the question of what is just and what is unjust. We can see that overtly authoritarian regimes, and they seem to be on the rise, permit open critique of the government only when they are sure that critical thought has no political power. Censorship is always a confession of fear. The censor exposes himself as a fearful being. He fears speech and seeks to contain what he imagines to be the power of another's speech. His fear attributes to speech a power that speech may or may not have. And when they start to come after the seminar, unionization, heterodox views, new forms of study that call into question established forms of economic and social domination, then we are getting the message. They fear thought. They fear the political power of thought in speech. They fear that critical inquiry, open-ended, protected by academic freedom, sustains deep alliances with open political contestations of authority. Are they right to fear this? Maybe so. In a sense, yes. Authoritarians have grounds to fear both sorts of freedom, academic freedom and the freedom of political expression. Since only when the state is restrained from intervening in the censorship or punishment of academic work, regardless of how it represents the state, and only when the state is restrained or ideally restrains itself from taking retaliatory action against those who exercise rights of political dissent, can both of these freedoms flourish, academic freedom and the freedom of political expression. Although academic freedom and freedom of political expression are not the same, punishing academics for their real or imagined political power tells us something about the role of universities within democratic life. Yes, universities produce ideas that come to have a life of their own. The free circulation of those ideas is part of a democratic political culture, and the protection of that very circulation is an obligation of democratic societies. Perhaps the structured form of conflict that defines academic freedom implies a broader conception of how to approach conflict resolution in other domains. Scholars disagree, and their disagreement is crucial to the growth of their new fields, their new knowledge. Cultivating productive forms of conflict is what we seek to do both within the walls of the university as we pursue knowledge and outside those walls as we engage in furthering democratic practices in the public sphere. When our Turkish colleagues, 1,128 of them, signed their petition for peace in 2016, they sought to reanimate a diplomatic negotiation between the Turkish government and the Kurdish political movement. They stood for speech, for a diplomatic negotiation between two groups, and they opposed violent conflict. They asked for demilitarization, for a dialogue that would be open, difficult, oriented toward achieving a form of reciprocal engagement in which violence would become a thing of the past. But for the Erdogan regime, the call for peace by these academics could only be understood as an alliance with Kurdish militants cast as terrorists. They were accused of making propaganda that supports terrorism. The call for peace could only be interpreted as support for violence when the political map consists of two violent positions and nothing more. The effort to break out of that very framework, to imagine an outside to that framework, to imagine peace, was immediately resituated within the logic of war. More than 69,000 students are behind bars. More than 5,000 academics have been purged from their jobs, and 15 universities have been shut down. And when Palestinian and Israeli scholars call for the end to the occupation, or if they affirm the Palestinian right to self-determination, even the right to return, or they call for a boycott to bring the state into alliance with international norms, why are they not regarded as searching for a peaceful resolution to an ongoing form of colonial rule? Instead, they are accused of treason or of seeking a violent overthrow of the state. It appears that for those who are at war, or who cannot think outside the framework of war, the critique of war can only be heard as a war cry. And what about the Iranian scholars who have been jailed or expelled, and the great threat to higher education now taking place in India, where the support for the rights of the Dalit can land a scholar in jail? What we call open debate or freedom of speech becomes an excuse, a ruse, an instrument for an opposition party to destroy the authoritarian. Authoritarianism is fueled by the desperate passion to amass power and to censor not just explicit political expressions of opposition, but to stop politically oppositional speech before it even has a chance to be heard. Academic freedom relies on democratic public institutions and democratic forms of government that are committed to the principle of non-intervention on issues related to the production and dissemination of knowledge. So the struggle for academic freedom belongs to a struggle for democracy. Academic freedom belongs to the university, and yet universities belong to their locations and polities. They belong to the global polity. And the walls are, yes, more porous than legal distinctions sometimes allow. The fear of the authoritarian, that is to say, the authoritarian's fear, his proper fear, is that some thought openly discussed in a university seminar will move outside those walls, and they are right to fear the fact that ideas circulate in ways that are in the main unpredictable and uncontrollable. And they are right to fear those ideas that contest the legitimacy of authoritarian rule or fascism or racist regimes, since once the unjust character of those regimes is demonstrated and discussed, once public life is given to those forms of critique, populations identify and oppose unjust rule and may well rise up to demand the end to injustice. This leads me to a final question. What obligations do governments and institutions have toward those who have been forced to leave their scholarly careers, their homes, their networks of kinship and their friends, their countries, for fear of persecution or arrest on the basis of their real or imagined political views? The task is, in part, to fortify national organizations dedicated to defending academic freedom, which includes the right to extramural political expression, but also to build transnational ties, new modes of cooperation that share wealth, workspace, community, and which give scholars at risk a new way to imagine their vocational future. We should provide the largest, the widest possible network of solidarity dedicated to the right to think and speak, which is part of the power of freedom itself. Together, we must think further about the kind of support, financial, institutional, and cultural, to be offered to scholars who have lost the guarantee and the condition upon which freedom relies, both their academic freedom and their freedom of political expression. A multilingual and multi-regional alliance that provides sanctuaries when universities or governments become persecutory, that supports freedom of expression in the face of its criminalization. Against this persecution of the free mind that exposes life to destitution, we must find and form a mindful and vital solidarity, one willing to make public its judgment of what is just and unjust, one with the power to unleash freedom as a contagious ideal. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Butler. You set the stage for our conference and you gave us so much to think about. But it was really a fascinating talk. Thank you very, very much. Before I close the opening session, I would like to invite you to a reception outside. And I want to point out that outside in the auditorium, just opposite to this auditorium, you will find a poster session. Many of you scholars really followed our invitation to present posters, and you all have the opportunity, not only today but also tomorrow, to look at the posters and to talk to the scholars. So I really would like to invite you very, very much and very supportively to this poster session. I now ask you to join me to the reception, and I'm very, very sure that we will have the continuation of wonderful conversation together, talks together. I wish you a lot of not only fun, but also a lot of severe and great discussions during our conference. And I'm hoping for a lot of new ideas how to support threatened scholars. I'm very much looking forward to, I hope, meeting all of you outside and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Thank you for your attention, and I'm glad that you are all here. Thank you very much.